St. Petersburg, January 22, 1905. A bitterly cold Sunday morning. Thousands of workers, led by a priest named Father Gapon, march peacefully toward the Winter Palace carrying icons and singing hymns. They're bringing a petition to Tsar Nicholas II, begging for better working conditions, an 8-hour day, and a voice in government. They believe the Tsar, the little father of all Russians, will listen to his people's suffering. Instead, soldiers open fire. Hundreds die in the snow, blood staining the white streets red. Bloody Sunday shatters the myth of the benevolent Tsar. The trust between ruler and people is broken forever. This is the story of how that broken trust exploded into revolution. Two revolutions in 1 year that toppled a 300-year-old dynasty, unleashed civil war, created the world's first communist state, and shaped the entire 20th century. To understand the Russian Revolution, we must first understand Imperial Russia, a vast empire spanning 11 time zones, containing 150 million people of dozens of nationalities speaking hundreds of languages. Russia was a paradox, a great power with a backward economy, an autocracy trying to modernize while maintaining absolute rule, a society where most people were illiterate peasants just one generation removed from serfdom. Serfdom, essentially slavery, had been abolished only in 1861, but peasants remained desperately poor, bound to villages by debt and tradition. They farmed with primitive methods on land they didn't own, paying redemption payments for land freed from nobles. Periodic famines killed hundreds of thousands. Peasants comprised 80% of Russia's population, yet owned little and had no political voice. The nobility clung to privilege and land. The Russian Orthodox Church preached obedience to the Tsar as divine mandate, and the Tsar himself, Nicholas II, who ascended the throne in 1894, was a weak, indecisive man utterly convinced of his divine right to absolute power. He believed God had appointed him Russia's autocrat, and that any limitation on his authority defied divine will. But industrialization was transforming Russia. By 1900, factories in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities employed millions. These workers faced appalling conditions: 12 to 16-hour workdays, dangerous machinery, starvation wages, crowded slums. They had no unions, no rights, no recourse. When they struck, Cossacks beat them. Revolutionary ideas, socialism, anarchism, Marxism, spread among workers and radical intellectuals. Marxism, developed by German philosopher Karl Marx, argued that capitalism inevitably exploited workers and would be overthrown by worker revolution, leading to a communist society without classes or private property. Russian Marxists formed the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1898. In 1903, it split into two factions: the Mensheviks, who believed Russia needed to develop capitalism before socialism could emerge, and the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, who advocated a disciplined revolutionary vanguard to seize power. Lenin was a brilliant, ruthless revolutionary. Born Vladimir Ulyanov in 1870 to a middle-class family, he became radicalized after his older brother was executed for plotting to assassinate the Tsar. Lenin devoted his life to revolution, spending years in exile, writing theoretical works and organizing. He believed a small, disciplined party of professional revolutionaries could lead the masses to socialism, rather than waiting for historical conditions to mature. This vanguardism would define Bolshevism. The 1905 revolution was Russia's first major upheaval. Bloody Sunday sparked strikes across the empire. In June, sailors on the battleship Potemkin mutinied. Workers formed Soviets, councils to coordinate strikes and self-governance. The St. Petersburg Soviet, led partly by a young revolutionary named Leon Trotsky, became a parallel government. Peasants seized land. Minority nationalities demanded autonomy. The empire teetered. Nicholas II, panicked, issued the October Manifesto promising a constitution and an elected Duma parliament. This divided the opposition. Moderates were satisfied, radicals wanted more. The Tsar used this split to crush the revolution. Troops returned from the disastrous Russo-Japanese War and suppressed uprisings brutally. By 1906, order was restored, but at a cost. The Duma was established but had little power. Fundamental problems remained unresolved. Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin attempted reforms, redistributing some land to peasants and modernizing agriculture. But he also ruthlessly suppressed dissent. The hangman's noose was called Stolypin's necktie. He was assassinated in 1911, and reforms stalled. Nicholas II, influenced by his wife Alexandra and the mystical peasant healer Rasputin, grew increasingly isolated from reality. Then came World War I in August 1914. Russia joined the Allies against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Initially, patriotic fervor swept the country. St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd to sound less German, but Russia was unprepared for modern warfare. The army was huge but poorly equipped, poorly led, and poorly supplied. Soldiers often lacked rifles, ammunition, even boots. They were sent to die in pointless offensives. By 1915, millions of Russians were dead or wounded. The army retreated. Nicholas made the catastrophic decision to take personal command of the military, leaving Alexandra and Rasputin to mismanage the government. Alexandra, a German princess, was suspected of treason. Rasputin, a debauched mystic who seemed to control her through his ability to help her hemophiliac son Alexei, became a symbol of government corruption and incompetence. The war devastated Russia's economy. Food production dropped, railways broke down, cities faced shortages, inflation soared, workers' real wages plummeted, strikes increased. By late 1916, even conservatives recognized the government was failing. In December 1916, aristocrats murdered Rasputin, hoping to save the monarchy. They were too late. February 1917. Petrograd is freezing and hungry. Bread lines stretch for blocks. Women waiting for bread have had enough. On International Women's Day, March 8, February 23 by Russia's old calendar, they marched demanding bread and peace. Workers joined them. Within days, 200,000 people are striking. Nicholas orders troops to suppress the demonstrations, but soldiers refuse. Some mutiny and join the protesters. The government loses control. Nicholas, at military headquarters, is oblivious to the crisis's severity. By the time he tries to return to Petrograd, it's too late. Railway workers block his train. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas II abdicates, ending the Romanov dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years. The February Revolution succeeds almost bloodlessly. Russia becomes a republic overnight. But what kind of republic? Two competing centers of power emerged. The Duma formed a provisional government. Led initially by Prince Lvov, then by Alexander Kerensky. This government represented educated society, liberals, moderate socialists, the middle class. They wanted a democratic republic, civil liberties, and continuing the war effort. Simultaneously, workers and soldiers formed Soviets, councils in Petrograd and across Russia, echoing 1905. The Petrograd Soviet, dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, represented the lower classes. They wanted immediate peace, land redistribution, and workers' control. This dual power situation was inherently unstable. The provisional government's fatal mistake was continuing the war. They believed Russia had obligations to its allies and that abandoning the war would be dishonorable. But soldiers and workers wanted peace immediately. This disconnect between government policy and popular sentiment would doom the provisional government. Enter Lenin. He had been exiled in Switzerland when the February Revolution occurred. The German government, hoping to destabilize Russia further, allowed Lenin to travel through Germany in a sealed train. Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station on April 16, 1917. He immediately announced his April theses: all power to the Soviets, peace, land, and bread. End the war, redistribute land to peasants, give factories to workers. No cooperation with the provisional government, preparation for socialist revolution. Most Bolsheviks thought Lenin was crazy. Russia wasn't ready for socialism. It needed bourgeois democracy first, according to Marxist theory. But Lenin argued that Russia's unique situation, weak bourgeoisie, strong working class, imperial war, allowed skipping stages. His audacity and clarity attracted followers. The Bolshevik message was simple and appealing: immediate peace, land, and power to the Soviets. The provisional government offered only vague promises and continued war. Leon Trotsky, who had been a Menshevik but joined the Bolsheviks in summer 1917, brought organizational genius. Brilliant, arrogant, and charismatic, Trotsky organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, preparing for armed uprising. He understood revolutionary timing and military organization in ways Lenin didn't. Throughout 1917, Russia spiraled into chaos. The June offensive, Kerensky's attempt at a major military attack, failed catastrophically. Soldiers deserted en masse. Peasants seized land without waiting for legal redistribution. Factories fell to workers' control. Minority nationalities demanded autonomy or independence. Food shortages worsened. Inflation raged. In July, frustrated workers and soldiers attempted an uprising, the July Days. It was premature and disorganized. The provisional government suppressed it, arrested Bolshevik leaders, and forced Lenin into hiding in Finland. The Bolsheviks seemed finished. But in August, General Lavur Kornilov, the army commander, attempted a coup against the provisional government, seeking to establish a military dictatorship. Kerensky, desperate, armed workers and freed Bolshevik leaders to defend Petrograd. Bolshevik agitators convinced Kornilov's troops to abandon him. The coup failed, but the Bolsheviks emerged as Petrograd's defenders. Their credibility soared. The provisional government was fatally weakened, seen as unable to maintain order or defend the revolution. By October, Bolsheviks controlled majorities in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Lenin, still in hiding, bombarded the party with letters demanding immediate insurrection. Timing was crucial. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets was scheduled for October 25th. If Bolsheviks seized power beforehand and presented it to the Congress as a fait accompli, they could claim Soviet legitimacy. On the night of October 24-25, November 6-7 by the modern calendar, the Bolshevik-led Red Guards moved. Trotsky orchestrated the operation with precision. They seized key points: bridges, railway stations, telegraph offices, power stations. Resistance was minimal. The provisional government barely defended itself. The climactic assault on the Winter Palace, where the government had taken refuge, was almost farcical, more infiltration than battle. Ministers were arrested. Kerensky fled in disguise. The October Revolution was remarkably bloodless in Petrograd. More people died filming Eisenstein's movie about it than in the actual event. Lenin announced to the Congress of Soviets, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." The world's first socialist government was born. But controlling Petrograd wasn't controlling Russia. Moscow saw a week of fierce fighting before Bolsheviks prevailed. Across the empire, some regions accepted Bolshevik power, others resisted. The SR party, representing peasants, had won the most votes in elections for a constituent assembly, Russia's first democratic parliament. When the assembly met in January 1918, Bolsheviks allowed one session before dispersing it by force. Democracy lasted one day. Lenin believed the revolution transcended parliamentary democracy. The Bolsheviks immediately issued revolutionary decrees. The decree on peace called for immediate armistice. The decree on land abolished private land ownership, giving land to peasants, fulfilling the SR program and winning peasant support. Workers' control of factories was decreed. Banks were nationalized. The nobility's titles were abolished. The Orthodox Church was separated from the state. Women gained legal equality, including the right to divorce, radical for the era. But the most urgent issue was peace. Germany was still at war with Russia. Lenin insisted on peace at any cost, believing that world revolution was imminent and that Russia needed to survive until European workers overthrew their governments. Trotsky led negotiations at Brest-Litovsk. German demands were harsh. Russia would lose Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, and other territories, a third of its population and agricultural land, half its industry. Many Bolsheviks opposed such humiliating terms. Trotsky tried a clever tactic, neither war nor peace, refusing to sign the treaty but also refusing to fight. Germany responded by advancing deeper into Russia. Lenin forced the party to accept reality. On March 3, 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrendering vast territories to gain peace. Lenin was right about necessity. Russia couldn't fight, but wrong about world revolution, which never came. Peace with Germany didn't mean peace for Russia. Civil war erupted. Anti-Bolshevik forces, the Whites, formed armies. Some were monarchists wanting to restore the Tsar. Some were moderate socialists betrayed by Bolshevik authoritarianism. Some were nationalists seeking independence. Some were simply opportunists. White armies formed in Siberia under Admiral Kolchak, in southern Russia under General Denikin, and in the Baltic under General Yudenich. Foreign powers intervened, sending troops and supplies. Britain, France, the U.S., and Japan all sent forces, ostensibly to prevent German seizure of Allied supplies, but actually to strangle Bolshevism at birth. Western leaders feared communist revolution spreading to their countries. The Bolsheviks faced enemies on all sides. The Bolsheviks, now calling themselves communists, created the Red Army under Trotsky's command. Trotsky proved a military genius, organizing an effective army from scratch. He imposed iron discipline, used former imperial officers as specialists with political commissars watching them, and employed armored trains as mobile command centers, racing from front to front. His ruthlessness matched his brilliance. Deserters were shot, as were their families sometimes. It worked. The Civil War was brutal beyond imagination. Both sides committed atrocities. The Whites massacred Jews in pogroms, blaming them for Bolshevism. The Reds executed class enemies, nobles, priests, bourgeoisie en masse. Peasant armies fought both sides, defending their villages. Famine killed millions. Typhus and other diseases ravaged populations. Estimates suggest 10 million died during the Civil War, more than Russia's World War I losses. In July 1918, as white forces approached Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar's family was imprisoned, local Bolsheviks executed Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and several servants. The Romanov dynasty ended in a basement, the bodies secretly buried. The murders ensured the Whites couldn't rally around a restored monarchy, but they also revealed the revolution's ruthlessness. The Bolsheviks implemented war communism, forced grain requisitioning from peasants, nationalization of industry, suppression of markets. It was partly ideological, building socialism, and partly necessary for survival, feeding the army and cities, but it devastated the economy. Industrial production collapsed. Cities emptied as people fled to the countryside seeking food. Money became nearly worthless. Barter replaced markets. The Cheka, the secret police, enforced discipline through terror. Thousands were executed as enemies of the people. The Red Terror, particularly after an SR assassin wounded Lenin in August 1918, saw mass executions. Lenin believed terror was necessary to defend the revolution. The Cheka became the prototype for later secret police, the NKVD, KGB, that would terrorize Soviet citizens for decades. But the Reds had advantages. They controlled Russia's heartland, including Moscow and Petrograd, the industrial centers and railway hubs. The Whites were scattered geographically, couldn't coordinate, and had no unified political vision beyond opposing Bolsheviks. The Reds offered clear ideology and ruthless efficiency. Peasants, though resentful of grain requisitioning, feared White restoration of landlords more than Red policies. By 1920, the Whites were defeated. Kolchak was executed. Denikin fled abroad. Foreign interventionists withdrew. Only Poland remained at war, having invaded Ukraine. The Soviet-Polish War ended with Polish victory, establishing an independent Poland and pushing the Soviet border east. But the Civil War was essentially over. The Bolsheviks had won. The cost was staggering. Russia was devastated. Industry produced a fraction of pre-war output. Agriculture collapsed. Famine in 1921-22 killed 5 million people. Peasants, pushed beyond endurance by grain requisitioning, rebelled. In March 1921, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, formerly staunch Bolshevik supporters, rose up demanding Soviets without communists. Trotsky crushed the rebellion, but it shocked the leadership. Lenin recognized that war communism couldn't continue. In March 1921, he announced the new economic policy, NEP. It was a strategic retreat from socialism. Forced grain requisitioning ended, replaced by a tax in kind. Markets reopened. Small businesses could operate privately. Only commanding heights, large industry, banks, foreign trade remained state-controlled. NEP was pragmatic compromise. Capitalism in the short term to rebuild, socialism as long-term goal. NEP worked economically. Agriculture recovered. Small businesses flourished. By 1928, production approached pre-war levels, but NEP created a new class of small entrepreneurs, NEP men, who seemed to mock communist ideals. Ideological purists were horrified. The revolution was supposed to eliminate capitalism, not restore it. Internal party debates raged about NEP's duration and socialism's path. Meanwhile, the party itself was transforming. During the Civil War, centralization and discipline became paramount. Democratic debate was suppressed. In 1921, Lenin banned factions within the party. Debate must end once decisions were made. This seemingly practical measure destroyed internal democracy. The party became a monolithic structure where dissent equaled betrayal. The Bolsheviks also created a one-party state. Other socialist parties, SRs, Mensheviks, anarchists, were suppressed. Only the Communist Party could legally exist. This monopoly on power eliminated checks and created conditions for later totalitarianism. In May 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke. Partially paralyzed and unable to work consistently, he watched his creation with growing alarm. He saw the bureaucracy expanding, growing corrupt and inefficient. He saw Joseph Stalin, the general secretary, accumulating dangerous power. In his final writings, Lenin warned the party about Stalin. Comrade Stalin has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution. Lenin suggested removing Stalin from leadership. But Lenin suffered additional strokes. In January 1924, he died at age 53. His body was embalmed and placed in a mausoleum in Red Square, becoming a communist icon. His death triggered a succession struggle that would determine the Soviet Union's future. Joseph Stalin, born Iosip Jughashvili in Georgia in 1878, was an unlikely revolutionary leader. Not an intellectual like Lenin or a brilliant orator like Trotsky, Stalin was an organizer, a bureaucrat, a man who understood institutional power. As general secretary, he controlled party appointments, placing loyalists in key positions. He seemed harmless, Lenin's gray blur, but he was building a power base. Trotsky seemed the obvious successor. He was brilliant, famous, had led the Red Army to victory, but he was arrogant, made enemies easily, and underestimated Stalin. Stalin skillfully formed alliances with other leaders, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, to isolate Trotsky. They portrayed Trotsky as an arrogant Bonaparte figure seeking dictatorship. The succession struggle masked ideological debates. Trotsky advocated permanent revolution, spreading revolution worldwide and rapid industrialization in Russia. Stalin eventually promoted socialism in one country, building socialism in Russia alone, without waiting for world revolution. This appealed to party members exhausted by war and turmoil, wanting stability. By 1927, Stalin had defeated Trotsky. Trotsky was expelled from the party, exiled to Kazakhstan, then deported from the USSR in 1929. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, writing critiques of Stalinism, until a Stalin-sent assassin murdered him in Mexico in 1940. Other opposition leaders, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, were politically defeated, then later executed during Stalin's purges. By 1928, Stalin had consolidated absolute power. He ended NEP and launched the first five-year plan, crashed industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. Russia would be transformed from backward agrarian society to modern industrial power within a decade. The cost would be millions of lives. Collectivization was catastrophic. Peasants were forced into collective farms, kolkhozes, giving up private land. Those who resisted, labeled kulaks, were killed or deported to Siberian labor camps. Peasants slaughtered livestock rather than surrender them. Agricultural production plummeted. In 1932-33, a deliberate famine, the Holodomor, killed millions in Ukraine and elsewhere, partly through forced grain requisitioning, partly through punishment of regions resisting collectivization. Simultaneously, breakneck industrialization built factories, dams, railways, and cities. The Gulag, the system of labor camps, provided slave labor. Millions were arrested for counter-revolutionary activity and sent to camps where they built Stalin's USSR. Working conditions were brutal. Countless died. The 1930s saw the Great Terror. Stalin, paranoid about opposition, launched purges. Old Bolsheviks were arrested, tortured into false confessions, and executed in show trials. The military high command was decimated, thousands of officers shot, weakening the Red Army before World War II. Ordinary citizens were arrested on quotas. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Children informed on parents. Fear ruled. Why did the revolution lead to Stalin's tyranny? Partly structural. Lenin's ban on factions, one-party rule, and acceptance of terror created foundations Stalin exploited. Partly circumstantial. Civil war brutalized society, making violence normal. Partly ideological. Marxist-Leninist certainty about history's direction justified crushing opponents as objectively reactionary. Partly personal. Stalin's paranoia and cruelty. The revolution that promised liberation produced one of history's most oppressive systems. Yet the Soviet Union survived and even triumphed. It defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, suffering 27 million dead but emerging as a superpower. It became the communist bloc center, spreading its system to Eastern Europe, China, and elsewhere. For 70 years, it offered an alternative to capitalism, inspiring some, terrifying others. It achieved universal literacy, industrialization, scientific advances, and space exploration. But it did so through repression, terror, and sacrificing individuals to the state. The revolution's legacy is complex and contested. It proved that revolutionary socialism could seize power and build an alternative society. It demonstrated centralized planning's ability to rapidly industrialize backward countries. It promoted literacy, education, and women's advancement. It defeated fascism and challenged colonialism. But it also created totalitarianism, killed millions through repression and famine, stifled creativity and freedom, and ultimately failed. The USSR collapsed in 1991, its economy stagnant, its people exhausted by lies and shortages. The utopian promises of 1917 ended in bread lines and corruption. Was the Russian Revolution inevitable? Perhaps. The Tsarist system was brittle, unable to reform or adapt. World War I broke it. Could it have turned out differently? Definitely. If Kerensky had ended the war, if the Constituent Assembly had been allowed to function, if different leaders had prevailed, Russia might have become a democratic republic. Instead, it became the Soviet Union. The revolution's ideas, equality, workers' power, ending exploitation, remain attractive. But its methods, terror, dictatorship, suppression of dissent, remain cautionary. The Russian Revolution reminds us that revolutionary idealism can lead to tyranny. That means shape ends, that power corrupts even those with noble intentions. From Bloody Sunday to Stalin's tyranny, The Russian Revolution was one of the 20th century's defining events. It shaped world politics for 70 years, divided the globe into competing blocs, inspired and terrified millions. It promised heaven on earth and delivered something far more earthly, a powerful but flawed state that ultimately couldn't sustain itself. The revolution's ghosts haunt Russia still. Should it be celebrated or mourned? Russians remain divided. Lenin's body still lies in Red Square, symbol of a revolution unfinished, promises unfulfilled, questions unanswered. The revolution that shook the world left tremors that persist today.